focus on how matching skills of players and then developing properly will really help build your culture. And we're going to talk to that with the offensive line coach at FIU, Joel Rodriguez. Coach, great to have you here on the podcast.
Keith, thanks for having me on, man. I've been a big fan of the podcast for a while now, and I'm super excited to be on here.
Coach, we know you played in the NFL, and you obviously had all those experiences that go along with that. And, I don't know if it was maybe those experiences that propelled you on to want to be a coach, or it's something that happened earlier. But for you, what was the draw to the coaching profession, and when did you decide you wanted to make that move?
It's an interesting question, and it's something that it's probably somewhat unique to me being in the profession now. But I actually fought being a coach kind of tooth and nail early on in my life when I first got done playing. I had my high school coach and people in my life that would, hey, you'd be a good coach. And I was like, you know what? Because I was close with my high school coach and my college coaches and the guys who I worked with in the NFL. And I knew what the life was like. I knew about the instability and the moving around and the hours and that kind of stuff. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do that initially when I first got done playing. I thought I was going to be a police officer or an FBI agent or something like that. And I was actually going down that route. And then I had a dead time in my life where I was waiting for the police academy to start up. And it was football season, my first year done playing and everything. And I was back home in South Florida. And my high school coach said, hey, why don't you come out and just help out? All the kids know you. And I think it'd be a good asset. You'll be like the assistant to the O-line coach. Just come for practices. You don't got to come for meetings or anything or that kind of stuff. And I did that. And within probably 2 weeks, some things happened where I became the O-line coach because the guy who I was working under was forced to leave. But more importantly, I got bit by the bug, and that's really where it hit me. Having the relationship with the players, watching guys. For example, I coached high school football that the rest of that fall and that spring. That fall and spring before I got my first college job, I had 3 or 4 linemen that had never played offensive line before. They were like fullbacks or JV linebackers or whatever prior to that. I had one really good national recruit named Greg Shaw, who was my right tackle. And then, over the course of a month worth of practice, seeing those guys go from being, a ragtag bunch of bad news bears to, running the ball for, I think, I don't remember what it was, but over 150, 200 yards in a spring game and winning the game and controlling the clock in the game and seeing how much pride they took in it and everything. It was like, literally, I got bit by the bug at that point, and I never wanted to do anything else. And I haven't ever wanted to do anything else besides this for the last, 13, 14 years.
I know before we got going, you mentioned some different influences as far as who you are as a coach right now, but a big one coming from the time you played for Mike Munchak, and that he's had a big influence on the way that you coach things. Can you explain to us exactly what that influence was and how it's made its way into really who you are as a coach today?
Yeah, 100%. So, like we talked off air before we started recording, I think Munch has probably had the biggest impact and influence on me as a coach, right, in terms of my coaching style, how I present things, how I deal with players, than any other individual person I've been around before or since. And the reason for it is this, I had a great high school coach, again, Joe Zacchio, who was very successful, won a couple state championships. He's retired now, and I'm still very close with him. Art Kehoe, who was like the legendary offensive line coach at Miami for 20 some odd years straight, was part of all 5 championships, was my line coach all 5 years in college. Those are my 2 major influences before Munch, and they're both kind of the same personality. Old school, fiery, get after you, light a fire to you, put their hands on you if need be, right, that kind of stuff. Munch was the exact opposite. I don't think Munch ever even raised his voice in the 2 years I was with him, but his point was always heard. It always got home. Just the way he delivered it and the way he packaged it to individual guys, and the way he was able to tailor. And what we talked about earlier was, his overall basic rules or basic tenets, schematically of how you block inside zone or how you block stretch or how you block power or gap scheme, whatever. They're very, very simple, and they're very kind of there's a lot of like kind of same as teaching to it, a lot of crossover. from tackles to guards to centers and so on and so forth. But what the genius with Munch is the way that he's able to tailor those things, not just to individual positions, but to individual players. And I'm sure it's from his time in the NFL, being in there for so long. Understand that, great players come in all shapes and sizes, and you can't coach a left tackle who's in year 14 and who's 6'3", 270 in the NFL the same way you can the rookie right tackle who's 6'6" and 330. There's different body types, and they move differently, and they react differently, and they have different strengths and weaknesses. So what they're asked to do for a living is the same, but how you ask them to do it is very, very different. And that's kind of probably the biggest influence on me, and that comes directly from Munch.
And, the way that I reached out to you, you actually commented on something I put out there, and I don't remember if it was the podcast on it or the article on it, but I've been putting together and looking at, how you match your personnel to the different schemes that are there. And we're in a time right now with, in the last year, the virtual space has opened up immensely. Not that it wasn't easy before, but we have all these Zoom clinics and guys connecting in different ways than you ever have before, and you don't have to, travel and spend a lot of time or money on things. You can get together with somebody for a little bit and learn things. So we've got all this knowledge flowing all over the place, but at the heart of what we do is still people. So while you may love what you saw in a scheme or in a clinic or on film or in a Zoom with somebody, you still have to fit people into that. And when we can put out there, and I started with it, here's the ideal lineman. Here's what we're looking for in these positions. But, those guys aren't necessarily available for everybody. And if you get one, you might not have five. So you have to look at what's going to be the most optimal thing for these guys to start. It's about skill utilization, skill placement. How do you put people in a position to succeed? And of course, there's still the development, because there's going to be deficiencies even in that, or there's going to be things that you aspire to move your team towards together, both as the individuals and as the unit. And, it's, again, that's something that I don't think we talk about enough as we look at things. We fall in love with those schemes or those systems and don't maybe put enough thought into what is our starting point on this. And that's something that, you're really talking about here, finding a way to make it fit for a certain player.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. As I mentioned earlier, I've listened to the podcast and I've read everything or most things you put out now for at least about a year or so. And it wasn't until I read and heard those podcasts that talked about, the strengths and weaknesses of, certain linemen in certain positions and kind of what an interior lineman does for a living in a zone or a stretch scheme offense opposed to a gap scheme offense is different. Same for tackles and so forth. And I couldn't agree more. I mentioned earlier when we talked off air that I was kind of hit in the face with that revelation early in my career. Thank God. I was maybe my second or third year as a full timer when I was at Bryant University up in New England, and we had just gone from D2 to FCS. We had kind of a talent deficient roster compared to who we're playing against in our league. But the biggest thing was, we kept saying to ourselves on defense at least, hey, we are a zone coverage, keep the ball in front of you type operation. So don't recruit safeties. Go recruit a bunch of corners, big corners, and the ones that can't play corner can play safety. And then over the course of a couple of years, we were a really, really poor pass defense. And then you go back and look at it, well, we were like in blitz man coverage, like 75% of the snaps. So we're asking guys to do something for a living that they can't do. And we're putting them in a very disadvantageous position. So we changed our whole recruiting philosophy to fit the scheme we wanted to be, which was a man blitz team. We recruited a bunch of guys who were really good man coverage guys. We had to sacrifice some size to get those guys, right? So we had a bunch of 5'8", 5'9", even a 5'7" kid. We signed 3 in that next class. All 3 of them were 4-year starters, and all 3 of them were multi-year conference players. And our defense became immensely better within the course of just, a year or two, because we actually had guys whose skill sets matched what they were asked to do for a living. And it's, obviously, as a line coach, it's the same. The last 2 or 3 offenses I worked in, we've been primarily spread, mostly inside zone, a little bit of gap, a little bit of map, tackle wrap type stuff, whatever. So, it's funny when myself and Coach Moorhead first got together at Fordham. We had known each other prior too, but when I first got hired there, we were talking about recruiting. He's like, well, I like to recruit all tackle bodies, all big, tall, long guys, and the ones that are too stiff or are not good to play tackle, we'll put them inside and make them guards. And I couldn't disagree more. So, well, based off of what it sounds like our offense is going to look like and what we're going to be doing for a living, those guys are going to have to win on the interior a lot of one-on-one matchups. If we're going to run inside zones to a three technique, we're going to run the tackle wrap stuff to an A-gap player. They got to hold up one-on-one and move guys at least horizontally, if not vertically, off the ball. You're not going to do that with a stiff, long tackle playing guard. They're going to get their ass kicked, So over the course of a couple of years, we ended up recruiting completely different. And there were some guys that were kind of like, swing guys. You always have some of those. But we started recruiting completely different body types for tackle, for edge players and inside guys. Our inside guys, we needed power. We needed girth. We needed guys that moved the pile when they hit it, right? They had some snap in their hips, had some pop and some punch. So you're not going to get those guys at the FCS level if they're 6'6" and 320, right? But you can get them if they're 6'1" or 6'2" and 315, right? So we were sacrificing length to get that power we wanted on the interior. And then the opposite was true on the edge. Our tackles were very rarely stressed in the run game because we had so much, interior stuff, whether it was, inside zone or the map scheme stuff. Where they were stressed the most was either as pullers in our tackle wrap schemes or in pass pro, right? Because obviously, tackles are always more stressed than pass pro. So for those guys, we were not going to sacrifice length or athletic ability, change of direction, quickness, that kind of stuff. But we would sacrifice some of the girth and the power because they didn't need it. So, and to me, the year that we were the best while I was there was probably 2014, I think it was. And we had both our left guard, left tackle were both first-team All-Americans that year. And both of those guys were completely different body types. The left tackle was 6'6", 275 pounds. He was a kid he was a third tackle in high school from St. Iggy's in Cleveland. He was a partial scholarship kid that worked his ass off and became an All-American. He actually grad transferred after I left and started at right tackle for Florida the following year in the SEC. And then our guard was a kid from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who was 6'2", 6'3", 315 pounds, who when he hit you, you felt it, right? If you had played the tackle at guard or the guard at tackle, they'd be very, very, very below average players. But because they were recruited to a certain skill set, to a certain scheme, and they put into that scheme and allowed to flourish and develop and all that kind of stuff like you mentioned earlier, they had great careers, and we all benefited from it.
When I look at and listen to you talking about that aspect of it, and again, just fitting people into at least a great starting point. As I said, I think coaching is also about developing people, but the success on the field, but also what that does for the culture of the team. And I think it's something that's not talked about enough. When we talk about the big grand ideas, the vision that starts everything, which is important, it has to start there. It has to start with those philosophies. But ultimately, it's about the results. And the results are you're really tied to the behaviors. And the behaviors in football, we're not just talking in the intangibles. I mean, we need the execution out on the field. And if you're wrong, if you put the wrong schemes in, if you put the wrong people in the wrong spots, it starts to fracture your culture. It starts to diminish their belief in you as a coach and really their belief in each other. And so it's hard to get things going when they don't feel they're in a position to have success. And I think it starts with understanding that fit.
I think you're absolutely right. And it's the same. I mean, look at it from an academic standpoint, right? I mean, let's just say, for example, Harvard and Yale seem to be two schools that everyone kind of agrees upon are kind of a cut above most other schools in the country in terms of the academic prowess and how demanding that would be for most students, right? Well, those schools have very high, rigorous admission standards for a reason, right? If you went and started taking a bunch of kids that were, very marginal or very average students and put them into those universities academically, some may flourish, who knows, right? But for the most part, the numbers will tell you that most of those guys would really, really struggle, or they would have to probably apply an overabundance of time to just stay above water academically and their social life and their athletic lives and everything else would suffer because of that, right? So they wouldn't have very well-rounded experiences, which would lead to a fracture in culture and would lead to them being, feeling, frustrated and why am I here and who brought me here and I'm doing exactly what coach told me to do or exactly what the professor told me to do, but I just can't get it, and you're absolutely right. I think when people think that they're doing all they can and they still can't quite cut it, it has a demoralizing effect on the individual and the collective. Absolutely.
So you had the opportunity to work with Joe Moorhead at Fordham, and while you guys were there, and you already alluded to one of those, the MAP schemes, right? You started to put together some schemes that fit very well with your personnel, exactly what we're talking about here. So, and I had remembered that when you brought it up before we started recording that, oh, you guys were the one. That's right. I remember that scheme. I was actually just thinking about it. I think it was last week. I'm like, whatever happened to like that scheme? I haven't heard a whole lot about it lately. But I did think it was it was very unique, especially at the time. But you guys did a good job with that. Could you explain the MAP scheme for our listeners?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, like I said earlier, if there's any kind of trademark rights to the name, it has to go to Andrew Briner, who was our quarterback coach and pass game coordinator, who's really, really good and really smart. Because he's the one that we were talking about, like what kind of scheme does this fall into, and because it's kind of half man, half gap. He's like, "What's MAP?" I'm like, oh, that makes perfect sense actually. So he's the one that kind of came up with the nomenclature for it. But in terms of what the MAP schemes are and kind of how it evolves, so it's literally the whole offensive staff, brand new staff. Joe gets hired from UConn. He brings some guys, a couple of GAs and QCs from UConn, a couple guys from other places. Myself, I came from Bryant. And we're going to put this offense together, right? And Joe, had some success running the one back power play. Actually, a lot of success running one back power and tackle wrap at UConn, his previous stop. But the issue was we didn't really have a tight end on the roster that we felt good about that matched up physically running true one back power and securing the edge on a 6 technique in the Patriot League because it was just a bad matchup. So I heard, well, how do we run one back power without a tight end, essentially, right? Or out of 10 personnel if you want to run to open side or whatever. So when they said, well, why don't we just man the guard and tackle play side and pull the guard around in the open gap, and then we'll kind of figure it out from there. That's kind of how the whole thing started. And of course, the tackle wrap stuff, the dart play, kind of falls into that as well. If you think about it. So it's man on the front side and gap on the back side. Or at least gap principles on the backside, and so that's kind of where it came from, and it kind of grew and grew, and we expanded how much we called it, how much we carried it with RPO packages attached to it, with zone read or read principles attached to it, and all these different things, and it's funny because you don't hear about it as much anymore, but like I spend a lot of time in the offseason watching other teams. I'm watching Oklahoma, and probably a third of their run game has some kind of MAP element to it. Everybody that runs tackle wrap, dart, that's a MAP scheme play. However you choose to verbalize it, that's a MAP scheme play in my mind, right? So it's still alive and well. It's just probably not. It's not new anymore, I guess, but it's still very much prevalent, at least in college football. I'm not sure it's made its way to the NFL just yet. But in college football, it's in the Big 12. It's in the ACC, it's all over the place.
Yeah, you definitely see it. You don't hear the term didn't get as sticky, I guess. The MAP.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, unfortunately, we'll blame Briner for that too.
With that, where did you like to run that to? What kind of front was the preferred front for that scheme?
Yeah, I think ideally you want to run it to an open B gap. That way the guard can kind of can compress down on the A gap player, and the tackle can keep the end at bay outside, and you have the open B gap for the 1 or 2 pullers to fit in there. But it was just part of our DNA at Fordham, especially by like year 2 and year 3, to where we were just able to call it and run it, and we didn't care whether it was a 3 or a 2 or an A gap bubble, B gap bubble, because in all reality, even if there is a B gap bubble, it may not be a B gap bubble once the ball snaps because of movement, but ideally, I think you want to run it where you can dictate where the B gap bubble would be, probably where you have the most success on it.
I know in terms of, again, making adjustments for your personnel. There was a time at Fordham where you guys had to get into some different things for your quarterback, a little bit with the swing and the draw. And talk to us a little bit about, again, that kind of adjustment, making sure that your people are positioned for success.
Yeah, definitely. So the offense evolved really. I was with Joe for 3 years, 2012, 13, and 14. The offense evolved dramatically, I felt like, each year. And again, it's all driven by personnel, right? So in 2012, we were just installing a base offense. It was our first year there. We were a very young football team. And we're still figuring out who our players are and what they do well. So we were a very generic, I won't say generic because Joe will probably hate when I say that, right? But kind of a pretty generic America's traditional spread offense, right? Inside zone, zone read, a little bit of the map stuff, a little bit of stretch from the flat back stuff, and of course all your play actions and sprint outs and drop back game. Very, very basic. 2013, we had a quarterback transfer in named Michael Niebrick, who transferred from UConn, who Joe had recruited to UConn. And Neebs was a great kid, a great athlete. He actually is a kid from Virginia who broke all of Michael Vick's high school records for touchdowns and yards and everything in a career. Okay, so Niebuhr comes in and he's a dynamic athlete at quarterback. So our run game, especially, our passing didn't really change too much because he could throw pretty well. But our run game became much more aggressive with the quarterback run. Interior reads. Backside three technique reads on the stretch stuff. We would run stretch and actually read the nose guard. So it's almost like running power read almost than the A gap in a way. Think about it. We were not afraid at all to have him pull the ball and run. There wasn't a lot of straight up quarterback run, like quarterback power, that kind of stuff. A little bit of pin and pull. But we were very, very deliberate with having the quarterback run be part of our offensive game plan week in and week out. That was 2013. That was the year we were really, really good. 2014 comes back around. The same team's back for the most part. And that quarterback is now coming off of a knee injury. So he was no longer the dynamic athlete he was in 2013. So now we have to protect him. We don't want him, carrying out zone read stuff. We don't want him pulling the ball on power read or that kind of stuff. So how do we protect him but still keep our offense integrity, right, and be able to run when we run? Well, RPO stuff became the answer. And we really, I'll be honest with you, was the RPO prior to 2014 in our offense was maybe less than 30% of our called runs had some kind of an RPO attached to them. By 2014, it was probably 80% of our runs had some kind of RPO attached to them, and it was, everywhere you can possibly do it, with the boundary of the field, the 2x2, 3x1, whatever it was. But it was completely out of necessity because our quarterback literally couldn't run. And if he did, he's going to get hurt and we're going to lose him and we need him to win games. And that's kind of where some of the imagination and that's helping Joe score points to this day at Oregon came from, was 2014 playing with a quarterback that couldn't run.
Flipping this to more of the personal development side and your growth as a coach as you continue through this profession, looking at, for you, just being at the right place, being at places you can develop, your philosophy on how you treat this. Because just like, we can get overwhelmed with scheme and all the different things out there. It's easy to go get caught up on Football Scoop and all the different opportunities and, a network of hearing, well, this is going to be open or that's going to be open. That can really trip you up as well. Your advice to an approach that way.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's very easy to get lost on the scoop on a daily, especially, that Thanksgiving to Valentine's Day time frame when all the jobs are coming open and all the movements happening. I think a couple things, number one, and this is kind of an oldie but a goodie, big time's where you're at. I think the guys that really adhere to that tend to flourish where they're at and get better opportunities, or at least move up where they're at, if you're coaching at the FCS level and all you're doing is looking at what jobs are open at the FBS level, chances are you're probably missing out something that you should be doing that day, whether it be a cut up or a study or recruiting or something, try to find ways to make yourself more valuable to where you're at. And that'll make you more valuable to where you're not at, That's the first thing. And the second thing I think is, and this comes more so maybe with time and maybe age and experience, but just try and surround yourself around the best people possible. And I don't necessarily mean the most successful, who have the most championships, or maybe who are the most upwardly mobile, because sometimes, and we've all probably seen this firsthand in some capacity, some of the most successful people that in our profession or any profession are some of the most miserable people, and people you don't really want to be around if you don't have to. You know what I mean? There are a lot of coaches who have won a lot of championships, won a lot of games, that if they didn't pay their staff, if they paid them, they would have no one working for them. You know, and that's fine if you're looking for a paycheck for a year or two, or if it's a means to an end. But I think when you want to, have a high quality of life, like what you do for a living, like who you do it with, I think being around good people that have your same goals in mind, your same values, same as anything else, same as picking a wife or picking a partner or picking anything else. It's very, very valuable. I've been very fortunate in my career. I've worked at a few places where it's funny. Like I made this statement before. I've worked for a few head coaches before where, like, literally every single day after practice or after workouts or whatever, when the team is addressed, the notes that I have on my list for what I want to tell my guys when I call them up after practice, he's already hitting them to the whole team. He sees the same thing I see, the same values, that kind of stuff. When that's happening, I know that I'm at a place that I should be at the time, and that my values are in line with the head coaches, which in turn will make my values in line with the whole programs.
Coach, you've already talked about a lot of great things on today's podcast, but for you, what's the one thing that really gives your players the winning edge?
I think the biggest thing is, I kind of alluded to it earlier, talking about Munch and his influence on me, but it's the ability to take very, very simple concepts, whether it be technique, whether it be pass, pro, run, get, whatever it is, right? Very, 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 very simple concepts, okay, that have a lot of carryover. That way you have some flexibility in terms of who plays where, all right? And then once you get your best lineup of guys where they belong, to begin to really drill down the details and tailor the details to that individual player, and so again, like I always mention, like, size, shape, right position, skill set, like no two players are the same, right? When I was at Bryant, I had an all-conference guard and an all-New England center. They were both four-year starters, both great players. They were both 5'9", and of course that's somewhat relative to where you're playing. I get that as well, but I couldn't coach those guys. And somewhere I coached a 6'6" right tackle. It just wasn't, their bodies didn't move the same way, right? Doesn't mean they were better or worse players. They're different players, So I think the ability that for my guys to know exactly, what's being asked of them, right? What the concept is, what the scheme is, and where does their cog in the wheel fit, I think is our winning edge.
Because for our listeners out there, what areas do you recruit?
Well, that's always in flux, obviously, because we got staff change going on, but I'll, of course, any offensive lineman nationwide, I'll be the primary guy for that. And then I also recruit South Florida, Dade, Broward counties, and I also recruit that the central western part of the state, so like Clearwater, St. Pete, Bradenton, Sarasota, that area as well.
I know you and I connected on Twitter. Share your Twitter handle with coaches.
Yeah, so I'm at Coach_J_Rod on my Twitter. And I'm pretty active on there. If guys want to message me or hit me up or whatever, I'm usually pretty good about getting back to guys and being open to anybody really.
Coach, I really appreciate your time and getting you here on the podcast and being able to talk to you about some of these ideas. And I look forward to keeping up with you and what you're doing. And good luck to you and the Panthers in 2021.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Keith. Like I said, I'm a huge fan of the show, a huge fan of what you're doing and all the content you put out there. So to be a part of it is awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for listening to the Coaching Coordinator Podcast. Please, if you are enjoying the podcast, head over to iTunes or Spotify and click 5-star for a rate. If you have a minute, write a review. It really helps the podcast. Check out our new home for the Coaching Coordinator Podcast. That's at coachandcoordinator.com. And follow me on Twitter at Coach K. Grabowski.